Okay, so we're here at the National Postal Forum to talk about international addressing standards. I'm Jody from GrayHair Advisors, and with us is,
Joe Lubino from Lubino and Associates.
try that again.
That was Joe Lubino from Lubino and Associates.
And I'm Mary Law from WorldView LLC.
So why is it that we might be interested in understanding the international addressing standards? Well, if I need to ship a package to my sister in Paris or a letter to my cousin in Munich, I don't necessarily know the address and the proper way to format that address to get those messages delivered. Tell us a little bit more about that, Mary.
Okay, there are 192 members of the Universal Postal Union, which is the group that oversees international postal matters. Of those 192 members, there are many more than that in terms of address formats, because France, for example, has French Polynesia, where you need to add the island in. So you've got a lot of countries, you've got a lot of possessions, a lot of possible variations. Some use postal codes, some don't. Some use a state or province like the US does, and some don't. So you've got all of that, and then on top of that, to make it a little more complicated, every country has multiple address formats. We have street addresses, we have P.O. box addresses, we have APO and FPO addresses, so there's multiple formats even beyond that within each country.
So, Joe, tell us about why and how you got interested in establishing standards for addresses throughout the world.
Well, as Mary was talking about, the Universal Postal Union, which is part of the UN and is in Switzerland, was little known to most Americans up until the 1990s. At that time, an American was elected as the head of the organization, Tom Levy, and he wanted to open it up more to the customers of the postal operators. So I was one of those to get an invitation, which carried a price with it, to join what they were calling the Direct Mail Advisory Board.
Okay.
And in the 90s, I started to attend the UPU sessions and learn about how other countries, as well as the US, dealt with international direct mail. The UPU had around that time established a standards board to make common standards in all areas of postal and mailing practices, and they hadn't really had that before. And one of the areas that was of interest to me because of my domestic responsibilities in the company I worked for was addressing. So after a couple of years getting more experience with the organization, I was involved along with the U.S. Postal Service. I was representing the Direct Mail Advisory Board, and a joint proposal was made to the Standards Board to develop a common addressing standard for all the members of the UPU.
What year was that?
Well,
Roughly.
the 2001, approximately, it went to the Standards Board and it became a proposed standard. So we had a committee and we worked on it, and by 2002, the first version of that standard came into being. And it's characterized by trying to set up a common vocabulary of terms, because we call something a street, they may call it a thoroughfare, other countries call it some term in their language, and yet there's a good basis for having a common terminology, because increasingly it's true that every country in the world, almost without exception, has probably a capital city, which has tall buildings, businesses, apartments, so there's urban areas. Every country, almost without exception, has rural areas, and usually less of a developed network for delivering things. Many countries have things like post office boxes, almost all countries. There's military addresses, and so you can easily multiply different address types. And although the languages are different, the concepts are similar, and a common vocabulary is therefore possible. We were also working at that time with the European CEN, which is the European Standards Organization. They call it normalization.
Right.
That's what the N in CEN is for, the Center for European Normalization. So we divided up the responsibilities between the CEN and the UPU, and the UPU was given the lead on the project because the UPU is a worldwide organization, and the CEN realized that they would be qualified at best to do a European standard. So that's how the project was organized.
Okay. So where are we now? If you give us a quick synopsis, Mary, I know that you're engaged in the committee now that Joe is on. Give us a quick fast forward to today.
Okay. Fast forward today, there are 40 countries that have approved their standards. The standards are descriptive. So they describe what the country says it's doing. They don't tell the country what it should do.
Nobody likes to be told what they should do.
Nobody likes to be told what they should do. And so it's a standard that describes. So if you get a set of the standards, you see what the country's addresses are like, using a common language among the countries where there, as Joe said, no common language. There are about 40 countries that have approved their standards, and there are about another 15 to 20 where a standard has been developed, but the country has not yet gone through the approval process.
Oh, maybe we should take a deep dive, and Joe, you can explain to us, pick a country, what was the process to try to establish the standard, understand and observe how it is that they're managing addresses and get the approval?
Well, it's different. The main difference is between developed countries and developing countries, which is the terminology that they tend to use at the UPU. For the developed countries, they may already have the wherewithal. They may have a national standard already. Mm-hmm. They may have an established postcode. They may, even at the beginning of our project, have had a delivery point database. That's the ultimate tool that you could use in developing an address standard. The USPS was the first to have a delivery point database, which is called the delivery sequence file, and they talk about it here at the Postal Forum.
Yes.
And it has all the delivery points in the United States described. Now, some other countries have maybe not a full delivery point database. They may have a database that contains most of the information that goes into most parts of the postal address, but they may not have, for example, that a certain house number exists on a street. So they might say the street exists, and you might have to know some other way if that actual house or building exists. And remember, they're constantly coming into being and occasionally go out of use. So if it's a developing country, it's a totally different story. Jody, you may remember that you helped me get an appointment with the Deutsche Post.
Yes.
And the Deutsche Post was very advanced in their address quality. And I went to Bonn and told them that we would like to understand the structure of their addresses for the benefit of people outside Germany that would be mailing into Germany, and to increase the accuracy of the mail going into Germany, which would directly help the Deutsche Post by not having to handle things that were undeliverable, and it would also help the mailer, and it would help the sending post as well if it's going through. If there is a sending post, it was a win-win-win situation.
Sounds like it.
But what they had to get over was they could easily misunderstand that I was asking them for free access to their database, which they don't provide and wouldn't really be that eager to provide. So when they understood that I was asking for the structure of the types of addresses and not necessarily for any actual addresses, just to know what the components were of the different types of addresses, then they agreed to participate.
Oh, great.
And this was, at the time, this was a good step forward. We had members of our first committee, some of whom are still involved, from the UK, France, and the United States. Mm-hmm. But Germany was a non-participant that was a developed country, and so that was the kind of thing we had to do. Now, it's quite different with the developing countries. Many of them, especially at the beginning of the project, did not have a postcode. Um, Many of them did not have a national standard for how addresses should be formatted, and most of them did not have a delivery point database or perhaps any sort of database. In that case, you can't say with any certainty how many delivery points exist in that country. And therefore, you can't say we've tried them all and we know that they work. But what you can do is you can work with the local postal addressing experts, and you can gather and collect the address types and what address elements make up those address types. For example, a street address might have a house number. Sometimes they have things like directionals. They usually have street types, such as avenue or street, and they have the name of the street. They may also have secondary numbers, which we sometimes call things like a floor or a door.
Or an apartment or a suite.
Or an apartment or a suite.
Okay.
And so it's down to that level that we document. Now, it is our philosophy that we are descriptive, but it begins to blur when you're talking to a country that doesn't have its own standard. There are more than a few occasions where we've wound up saying, well, look, you could have this organized and ordered this way, or you could have it that way. Is there a preference that you have? So we might present decision-making opportunities to them. And if they don't have a national standard, this could facilitate them developing a national standard.
Oh, okay. Mary, what were you thinking?
Well, I just wanted to add that there are more countries in the developing country group than there are in the developed group.
Wait, I'm confused. Developing versus developed. So developed would be U.S.,
U.S., Western Europe, Japan,
Thank
Australia.
you for the specifics.
Developing much of Africa, some of South America, the Caribbean. The countries that have less developed economies, less manufacturing.
Yeah, this category is somewhat challenging since
Yeah,
we like to believe that we're developing all the time.
Well, we are, but we've hit a stage that they call developed. So the countries that are referred to as the developing countries that may not have an address standard, and as Joe said, this helps them develop one, which makes the mail easier to deliver, because in a lot of those countries, they've used descriptive addressing.
So
The red house across from the church.
Right. Okay, the house across from the church.
That doesn't help us.
Right. So how do these standards help your customers?
Customers have databases. I mean, I'm sure that everybody listening to this has a database. And if you've got these descriptive addresses, you have no idea if the address is correct or not. There is literally no standard. If there's a standard, you can say, okay, the address for this country is supposed to have this in it. We've got all of that. We may not know that the house number is correct at that street. We might not be able to verify the delivery point. But we know now that we at least have all the parts that are supposed to be there for deliverability. Mm-hmm. And that's a big step up.
So what's the next step, Joe?
Well, before going to that, I'd like to amplify
Great.
what Mary has said. Even in the United States, before 1991, when that delivery point database came into being, you couldn't validate the address completely. You could say this is a possible address, but you couldn't say this is guaranteed to be an actual address. And that's where we stand with the developing countries. If they don't have a delivery point database, some of them are beginning to move in that direction, we could take a file of addresses and we could divide it into, if you will, two piles. One is addresses that can be correct. We can't say they're not correct. They might be correct. And ones that are definitely not correct. This is helpful because then you can work on the ones, and you maybe don't want to mail to the ones that you know can't be correct. Nothing really good is going to come out of that. But if you know that they might be correct, then that's the best assurance you can get if there's not more technology available to validate them. But really our goal is to have the countries eventually all develop databases that are very detailed in which case you can divide the addresses into two piles once again, but now one pile is valid addresses and the second pile is invalid addresses. Now that's of high value. We're not discussing it much yet, but there's another issue, which is the party to whom the piece is being addressed actually there? That's what we call the change of address problem.
Sure.
And that can also be handled through this technology. I'll tell you an anecdote. The Royal Mail in England, when they participated, they had a complete database of addresses, the PAF file it's called.
Yes, PAF.
PAF.
What does that stand for?
Postal address file.
Oh,
Yes.
very simple.
Yes. And it was a complete file of addresses, but not a file of names, not even company names, not personal names.
What
Of course,
about the house name?
the house in England, they have house names, and they would
it's
be
in
on
the
there.
PAF.
They would be on there.
Okay.
But that's somewhat unusual. For example, in the U.S., there is no such thing as a house name, except maybe what you might want to refer to as the name of your house if you're a little pretentious or something like
Well,
that.
you have a vacation home, you refer to that versus your primary home.
Yes.
It's anecdotal. It's not in any database in the USPS.
The anecdote that I'm trying to get to is that the Royal Mail didn't want to supply names. They said, of course we can't supply actual names because of privacy regulations. And we said, we understand that, but we want to know the syntax and the order of the name elements. So we agreed finally that we used either made-up names or names of people that were dead. Sir Winston Churchill, for example.
Yes.
And that tells you the order of the name components. Now, what the Royal Mail wasn't thinking about was change of address. As everyone of us knows, change of address requires that you match rather exactly to the
Yes.
name of the party, and therefore you have to get the elements in the name lined up in the proper order and hopefully spelled correctly as well so that you can match to the name. And if you don't have that ability, then you are going to mail to correct addresses but parties that are no longer there. And it is within our mission to validate names as well as addresses.
And in the UK, they call them gonaways, right?
Call them what?
Gonaways.
I've never heard that term, but you're welcome to.
It's apparently used
yeah.
only in a postal sense.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's not a friend in the
It's
UK.
postal jargon.
Yeah,
Okay, skip it.
yeah.
Do you want to talk about the PAF file and what happened next, or
You want to do more on PAF?
No, I'd rather mention this: the development of the standards.
Good.
We had a UPU standard from the year 2002, and despite that, it didn't mean that everyone was immediately saying, "Oh, thank you. This is what I've needed all the time." And why was that? One is that we only had certain countries where we had the coverage. So some people would say, "Call us back when you have more countries." Some people said, "Who's the UPU? Are there other addressing standards out there?" And of course there are. There's commercial and other standards bodies, national standards bodies. So there's actually different address standards to choose from. However, in the world of standards, the top level is the ISO, International Organization for Standardization.
those are the ones that made the symbols for the restrooms?
That's right. That's why the symbols for the restrooms. And like other standards, you can think of counterexamples where the standards for how you depict the symbol on the restroom may not apply to, for example, a Scotsman in a kilt
Right.
or a woman in pants. And so that makes a point about standards, which is sometimes they truncate what's the options available in the real world. We have tried not to do that. In principle, we're being descriptive if we don't have to be a little bit prescriptive, and we're also trying to be complete. So when we tested our USPS template, we did a random sample of all the delivery points in the US, and we weren't saying change this or change that. only if we came up with something on the USPS database that was incomplete, something that hadn't been filled in. An example would be a rural route without a number.
Yeah.
Standardly, a rural route has to have a number. There were a few cases where the rural route didn't have a number, and in that case, we would say we don't want to cater to that. We want to have that investigated and ultimately repaired. That's another side benefit of standards. You wind up identifying non-standard cases, and you can
Right.
eliminate them.
And in that case, we didn't do anything other than query
Yeah.
the USPS addressing authorities and say to them, hey, we found this,
Yeah.
and it looks like it doesn't match the standard that we've got. Is this something that is correct? And they said, oh, we're going to fix those. So we came up with something that needed to be, no pun intended, addressed by the USPS. So it's not all just we're describing it for the mailers. It's also of a benefit to the postal authorities to participate in the work. And while we may not have 192 or 100 even, we do have all those countries that the USPS tells us are the ones that get most of the mail in the world.
Oh, that's great.
Those are all covered.
Right.
Yes. Even China, not Russia, not India. India is a particularly challenging case because they don't have complete management possibility for their own addresses, being such a diverse
What
and
does that
large
mean?
country. There is no database, and
Okay.
there is a lack of complete knowledge of all the address types, even from the people who would be in the best position to know.
Okay.
But we
So
do have China.
tell us more about China.
China is in the UPU terminology, they would be a developing country. But as everyone realizes, they're a rather powerful developing country and not at all incapable of developing address standards and even address databases. Some years ago, they started with major cities like Beijing and Shanghai. And now they're covering at least most of the country with an address database. So it was about 2011 when they participated in an Asian conference and were able to develop a template. One thing that is worth noting is that this standard, once you have the common vocabulary, something like a town, for example, it doesn't matter whether the country is speaking Arabic, Chinese, Thai, or what have you. They can identify the concept, they can have data populating the field of town, and then we're using those as sort of like pieces on a board that we can manipulate to get the right order and the right lines. So the beautiful thing about this standard is that rather than have to have an expert on your staff or a set of experts that collectively speak all the major languages of the world, you can actually maintain a database and produce valid, or at least not invalid, addresses without knowing the language and without even understanding the script, even if it's right to left, as Arabic is. So this is what makes this possible. We do a lot of work with XML, the extensible markup language. For those who want to know the technology, XML is excellent for identifying data that has variations and isn't always the same from case to case.
Is that more common in some countries versus others?
XML is by now a worldwide technology used extensively in data processing. I was referring earlier to the ISO.
Sure.
We begin with a meeting in Copenhagen in 2008, and they wound up formulating a multi-part standard. One part of it is postal addresses, and they agreed to use the UPUS 42 as the basis for their part of their addressing standard that deals with postal addresses. Some of the other parts deal with how to develop addresses or how to have quality addressing or even physical addressing of things like fire hydrants or pieces of property.
Oh, so I could have something delivered to the fire hydrant I'm standing at?
I don't think so. In the maybe one of these dogs that GrayHair has could deliver something to the fire hydrant.
Where do you want to go from here?
Stop laughing about you and the fire hydrant.
You brought it up.
It was fun.
Yes, you could deliver something to a fire hydrant, but that's not a postal address. A postal address is delivering something to a person or a company. So we're not trying to identify every
Object.
option, every place.
Yeah.
It's a systematic way to describe a property where somebody resides or somebody works.
So despite these other applications of addressing in the broad sense, postal addressing is limited to postal delivery points. So in that sense, our problem is a subset of a larger problem called addressing physical objects in general. But in another sense, we're not a subset because, as I explained, we care about the name of the party and the change of address, whereas the geographers, who are the the core of this ISO committee, they don't care so much about that. So it's sort of an overlap situation. There's part of our scope that we insist upon the name as well as the address
Right.
being in the standard. It's moving along. In about 18 months from now, we hope to have an ISO standard for postal addressing, which will be the same as the European standard and the same as the UPU standard.
Oh, that's really soon.
This might be enough to convince large companies to develop against the standard because it would have achieved a certain preeminence
Right,
where
a
they don't have
combination
to
of
ask.
the majority of the countries with the mail volume.
Yes.
And the technology.
the standards bodies that are the most
Right.
authoritative. Now there's another barrier, but I'll pass that over to Mary.
We've already had one country where we didn't have a standard.
Yeah.
Look at the UPU information, Belgium, and develop a standard using the UPU terminology, and then brought it to the UPU and said, did we do it right?
Yes.
Oh, that's great.
It's
Yeah.
great when you have people that aren't in your work group and they understand what you're
Yeah,
doing.
no,
And they
I
had
think-
to do it in 3 languages.
Yeah.
Well, because of the common terminology that we were talking about, that, it doesn't matter if you're in Chinese or Arabic or French or German or English, the common terminology allows them to define the addresses for all different languages without having to translate.
Now, this seems like such a success story. So then, why is it that it's still going to be a challenge to get this completely used? If it's accepted as authoritative and it has the coverage, that seems like a very good start. However, here's the Achilles heel or the barrier that we're still going to face. To get addresses completely defined in the way that each country defines them, you have to go down to a high level of detail, what we call a high level of granularity. Some countries, for example, let's say it was Rue de la Paix in French. Some countries would put Rue de la Paix in one field, Rue de la Paix. Some countries would say Rue is a street type, nothing wrong with that, and they'd put Rue in one field and de la Paix in another one. Some countries will say de la is some kind of a connector,
Right.
and they'd put Rue in one field, de la in a second field, and Paix in a third field. So we have to be able to go down to the greatest level of granularity to map, as we call it, to map the data to the fields. Fortunately, nobody separates de and la. De and la are only one field, even though it's 2 words, okay? I have a friend in Chicago who lives on Pine Grove Avenue.
Yeah.
Pine has no meaning independently. Grove has no meaning independently in postal addressing. Pine Grove is what you want to catch. So an element is not a word. It could be a combination of words. But they have to be broken down by function. So avenue is a separate element from whatever, the name of the avenue. Now, most of the customers of Mary Law, most of the large companies who have address databases, you don't find them broken down to that level
You
of
get
detail.
line 1, line 2, line 3.
It would be nice if they even had line 1, line 2, line 3 in some cases. Line 1, line 2, line 3 is a very common paradigm, which is, from the point of view of our work group, inadequate, because line 3 could be the name, it could be a street address, it could be a company name, it could be somebody's title. You haven't broken it down. I think we would agree that it's an improvement if you say name line, or company line, or street address line, or P.O. box line. But even then, you still have what we would call composites, not elements. 101 North Main Street is a composite. And so S42 recommends breaking that into 101 North, Main, and Street. If you break it into those parts, then you have to be able to assemble it. And that's part of S42, is to provide the technique and the algorithm for assembling the addresses from the parts. And there is where the software would have to be made available widely, or written by different parties and used in each company separately, in order to be able to assemble the address from the parts. That's probably the barrier that is facing us. However, it's important to say that we are not rigid and uncompromising about the very principle that is at the base of our technology.
We can create constructs from the elements.
There you go. You could have a subassembly.
Right.
101 North Main Street could be stored, if that's what people want to do, they could store that in one composite.
In one composite, made up, in our terms, of 4 different elements.
And use it as though it were a single element.
Yes.
In assembly. And therefore, I can confidently state, and we haven't emphasized this perhaps enough, that any degree of granularity that you have can be subject to this process of disassembly and assembly.
The Humpty Dumpty story.
What?
It's the Humpty Dumpty story.
Yes. If you break it apart, you can't put it together again? Well, we could put it together again, but you might not break it apart all the way. And therefore, there's an evolutionary path, we would contend, from what you're doing now, which hopefully is better than line 1, line 2, line 3, but maybe that's what you do now.
Not. Right.
Identify those lines. Figure the postcode, for example, best to be an element. That's common practice.
The postcode has, in the U.S., everybody breaks out their postcode so that they can sort properly to get discounts.
Mine is, my last line is Chicago, Illinois 60625. Most companies will break that at least into 2, if not 3 parts. So you see, this creates a situation of great problems with conversion. I used to work managing address files, including some of your address files in your prior employment. And when we wanted to assemble a composite address file to make a mailing list, they would come from different sources and they would have different formats regularly. And so the first thing that people had to do, and we had a whole department to do this, was to kind of get them into a common format so that we could compare them. For one reason, to eliminate duplicate addresses from different mailing lists. And then we had to do at least a primitive form of assembly to get the address lines together. There's an untold amount of labor going on in the United States and elsewhere to manage differing address formats. It's one of the biggest problems in the mailing and shipping industry.
Sure.
And this technology might take a while, but it carries the potential of lessening those problems.
It sounds like we're on the edge of the technology making a difference in the world. We just need the software to be developed and then adopted.
Yes.
But you've done all the foundational work, at least for the largest countries that get the most mail, so that I don't really need to know how the country formats the address. I can use the templates that you've created.
And moving forward is easier because we've already created that common language. So you can talk to people about an address. My state is your province, is their territory, is their district. I think of a district as part of a city. In some countries, the district is the equivalent of a state in the United States. We've created that common language. So now somebody can look at this and somebody says, but that's a district. We can say, but it's this element and it's therefore equivalent to this in our country. So it makes it easier to work internationally.
Another barrier that Mary could expound upon more than I could because of her clients is that just because a country introduces a postcode doesn't mean that it's in wide use.
Right.
So our standard will reflect if the country has a postcode, and it will know where the postcode is supposed to go. But it will also be able to detect, S42 can identify elements being mandatory or optional, and therefore we could provide a full report. And unfortunately, it might say your address list only has 32% of the postcodes, which are supposed to be a part of the address. It helps
Sounds
to
like
be able
useful
to
feedback, though.
helps to be able to diagnose that. A lot of what we're doing is recapitulating what the U.S. Postal Service has done. All of us were involved in that process, and applying the same tools across borders creates technical difficulties, which we are trying our best to resolve, and political difficulties,
Which are beyond our control.
Which are beyond our control. So in the future, my vision would be that you could do internationally what you can do in the United States. Validate your addresses against the database. See who has moved. Format the addresses correctly and know that they're formatted correctly. Even maybe get lower rates for providing addresses that are formatted correctly and known to be formatted correctly. Mail them and not have to worry so much about returns, forwarding, waste. The three main components of undeliverable is address mail.
Okay.
Well, even before we get to that point,
Yeah.
what we could get to before we get to knowing whether or not this person is at that address, because of privacy concerns with some countries, wouldn't it be nice to be able to validate that this is a delivery point and get rid of all your undeliverable addresses?
Oh, that would be better than nice.
Yeah. Think of all the money you'd save.
Right.
There would be companies that aren't viable as businesses under the current address hygiene regime internationally that could stay in business or enter into the business of international commerce, including e-commerce, if this technology were to be widely available.
Well, I hope it is. Anything you want to close with? That's good.
That last bit was close.
Okay. Well, hope you had fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Okay.
Do you think you can edit that into...
Yeah, I think he's going to do lots of editing.
Yeah.